probably be a little different from what you've just been hearing about, so we'll see how it goes. So I'm going to talk about navigation. I talk mostly about both real environments, virtual environments, bigger spaces, but also in the context of buildings. So when you're learning a new city, not only do we need to remember and learn the locations of places that we're interested in going, right, shops, restaurants, things like that, we also need to learn the layout of streets, so which roads intersect with each other, which road should you take to get to this museum, which road should you take to get to the beach if you're in Southern California. And you might take a meandering path as you're walking around in a new city, but then you want to go back straight to your hotel, so if you're going back to your hotel today, you might need to go straight back there. You might not retrace your steps, but you might actually just need to take sort of a shortcut to take the most direct path back to where you're going. And the same goes for a building and built environment. So there might be more constraints on the environment, and there might be different structure to that, but the basic principles of understanding how people learn their environments and how they acquire spatial information, how they use that spatial information, can apply to built environments as well. And then once, of course, you actually learn this new city or building, you need to be able to take effective routes through that. You need to be able to run errands. You need to be able to take flexible paths, which often doesn't always necessarily happen. So sometimes you might have meant to stop by a colleague's office on the way in, but then you went on autopilot and ended up in your own office instead. Probably had that happen to us. We know things like GPS systems aren't always designed and working in the way that we want them to work, and we know that people don't necessarily get all that information out there. And in addition, there's sort of confusing street signage and all these sorts of things. So my lab asks all of these questions. So we ask questions about how does the brain use spatial information. So there's lots of different processes involved in learning spatial navigation. So attention, perception, memory, all kinds of things are involved. And how does the brain process that? How do individuals differ in their spatial navigation abilities? So we know that some people are great and some people are not so great. And you probably know who you are. And it's okay. And what we're interested in is finding out how those people differ and how to sort of help people who maybe aren't so good. And I take a bunch of different perspectives. So I do cognitive and neuroscience perspectives and use a lot of different techniques in that. So we use immersive virtual reality. We also use GPS tracking systems for people in the real world. And then we also, on the neuroscience side, use fMRI and EEG to understand how the brain is doing this. But so my research asks a bunch of central questions. So first, what is the structure of spatial knowledge? Is it really a map? Or is it something a little more flexible and maybe a little less detailed? Probably it is. So I think it's probably something more like a connection of street networks and things like that, but you don't necessarily need to know all those distances and angles in each direction. How can we learn new environments? So what's the best way for us to learn these new environments? What kind of learning processes will help us? What sort of information do we need? What do we need to pay attention to? Things like that. And then what sources of information do we need? So we need visual information. We need information from our bodies as we walk around to sort of track distance information. And what sources of that contribute to tracking your own self-motion as you move around. And how does the brain do this, right? So how does the brain track your own self-motion? How does the brain learn new environments? How do we understand what's going on there? And then finally, what happens to our navigation abilities as we age? And so thinking about the aging process, people are getting older, there's going to be differences in people's navigation abilities, how they understand these environments, and then how can we perhaps help design things around that. So I just want to talk, just introduce you guys to sort of two really broad types of navigation. So the first broad type of navigation is called path integration, which is this continuous updating of position and orientation in an environment as you move around. So as you're sort of walking around, getting a sense for how far you've turned and moved at every different, with every different step. We often think of this in sort of a desert environment, thinking about something without landmarks. So you really just have to use your own body and information from that. And then our other type of navigation is landmark-based navigation, which is more of these complex environments with street signs, buildings, landmarks, lots of information that helps us, but sometimes can be detrimental in other ways too. So understanding how we use landmarks and how we use that information. And so I study both of these aspects of navigation. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about path integration first, talking about self-motion. So just to introduce you to a couple things that might contribute to our sense of self-motion. So we have information from our visual systems. First is called Optic Flow, so that's about information about how fast you're moving, so that's a sort of Star Wars effect, right? So when you see things going past you really fast, you think you're moving more quickly. You also have information from proprioception. This is your joints, your muscles, your body-based information to say where things are moving. So if I know my arm is moving behind my back, even though I can't see it, because I have proprioceptive information that's giving me feedback about that. We also have the motor command. So when I move my arm behind my back, I'm also commanding my arm to move. We get information in that sense. Get a copy of that. And then there's vestibular information, which is information from your inner ear, which is helping you with balance and rotation. It helps learn accelerations and changes in direction. So all of these things are contributing. So I do a lot of work looking at these different various contributions to this. So I just want to show you an example that we're doing in the lab. So this it's a path integration task. There's not a lot going on here. This is what the participant is seeing because we put people in virtual deserts because we want them to just be able to use their own sense of self-motion. So what's happening here is that we have people walking in a circle. There's two things there because we have for each eye, so that's what we're getting here in the virtual reality here. People are walking in a circle, and we just ask them to click the mouse when they think they've returned back to the place they've started. So it's a very simple task. It's actually quite complicated in the sense that it's hard. And so we have our experimenter walking the person around, and that's what it looks like. So we walk people in a circular path. And we've done this in different ways. We've done this with and without vision. We've done this walking and in a wheelchair and things like that, just to get a sense of these different body-based contributions to navigation. And we've actually found equal contributions of vision and walking in this paradigm. We've also looked at the brain, so using the same type of circle task, we've tried to understand how the brain can process this and how the brain understands where it is. So just as a little note about circles, there's something kind of cool is that you go further away from home and then you return back to the place you started and you get closer and closer. So we can look for some signal in the brain that follows that same pattern where things are sort of increasing and then decreasing again. And we found a number of brain regions that show that pattern, so that seem to be tracking a location in space. So then turning over to the more complex environment side, there's a number of different factors that could help you learn these more complex navigation or landmark-based environments. So first we can have allocation of attention, so attending to different aspects of the environment, paying attention to street layouts, paying attention to different buildings, things like that, so understanding what's important and attending to that. You could also have cognitive decision-making as a different contributor, so making decisions about where you want to explore, to making and testing predictions about what you're going to see. So saying like, oh, I want to turn right. I think that's going to be where the coffee shop is. And then it's there, and you get a little feedback, or maybe it's not, and you get a little signal saying that you're wrong, right? So things like that would be important for learning any place. And then finally, mental manipulation of the spatial information. So being able to take a different perspective. So this is like a mental rotation task. You can think about which one of these three is the same as the one on the top that just rotated. So this would be something like if you're walking down the street and on your right-hand side, first you encounter the fire station and then the grocery store, knowing that when you come back the other way, those things will be on your left, and first you'll see the grocery store and then the fire station. And so we test this idea in a more complicated maze-like environment. So this would be more of an indoor space, building type of space. Here, this is again using virtual reality. So in this case, again, people are walking around in a big empty room. This is the type of thing that people are seeing in this environment. Some objects, some like paintings on the wall. This is an overhead view of the maze that people learned. With the blue dots are different objects in the maze, and the red rectangles are the paintings on the wall, which are sort of landmarks to help them around. So we want to see, whether or not people can learn this environment, how well they can learn it, and what factors contribute to this process. So in this case, we had people either actively deciding where to navigate for when they were exploring this environment, or we had people, we took them on a path, and so they were passively exploring. So they're still walking around, but they were not able to decide where they wanted to go. So they just had to follow a path. And so what we found is that overall, people who were free to make decisions did better than people who were guided. So if you were able to sort of freely explore and figure out where you wanted to go and how you wanted to learn, you did better than if we just took you on a path. And this was the case overall, both in a walking condition and in a video condition. But what's perhaps even more striking is that we found these massive individual differences. So this dashed line is chance, and what we have here is people ranked in order from worst to best. And so people on this end, there were people who were at chance and basically got almost nothing right, and people who got basically 100% right, both in the free and guided conditions. So people, it's not the case that you have to do super well if you're free to explore. You can totally do poorly, and you can also do well even if you're guided. So there's a lot of intrinsic ability that people are bringing to this task, and so we're trying to understand more about why some individuals are better than others. And so we're doing that right now in a study in the fMRI scanner. So this is what we're showing right now, is having people do basically the same task in a desktop virtual environment, because in the fMRI scanner you can't walk around, otherwise it won't work at all. So what we have here is people going from one object to another object, using the tabs of the maze, and just pressing a button at each intersection about where they want to go. So what we're doing is seeing whether or not better navigators have sort of increased brain connectivity between different regions of the brain using fMRI. And we've also done the same in an EEG paradigm, looking at active decision making and whether or not that increases synchronous communication in the brain. It seems to do so. And then just to wrap up, I want to talk a little bit about human health and the importance of navigation to health-related issues, in particular for aging. So we know that navigation has emerged as a sort of early marker for dementia in different ways. And obviously Alzheimer's and aging is a big issue coming up. Another sort of little tidbit is that women have twice the risk of dementia than men, so there's also these big sex differences in this. And we also know that there's these giant sex differences in spatial navigation ability as well. So we kind of want to understand the connection between these, especially considering that sex hormones have this big influence on the hippocampus, which is one of the main areas for spatial navigation in the brain. And so what we're doing now, actually with one of my collaborators, Mary Hegarty, who's here, as well as Emily Jacobs at UCSB, is trying to do several of these tasks in a midlife population, so in the sort of 45 to 55-year-old range, which is also when women go through menopause, and so we're trying to understand these differences in sex hormones, as well as aging, and comparing that to our healthy younger adults as well. So we have that loop test, which I showed you earlier, that maze learning task, as well as a strategy learning task, which I think Mary will talk about later on today or tomorrow. So we're trying to understand a little bit more about that. Okay, and so with that, I will wrap up and just say thank you for your attention and to my collaborators. Thanks.